This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this talk I'm going to begin a series of talks that has been requested of me for years, really. One that I've been eager to engage in and get started, but I just haven't had the leisure to do so. But at an important point in my life, I do have the opportunity presently to undertake this study. And while it's going to be a challenging study for me, because in this study I'm really going to be challenging myself to work through and articulate these ideas for the first time, I think it's going to be very helpful and a source for many new discussions in the future. We're going to study a work that was actually written by the famous ancient physician Hippocrates. If you look in Greek history, you'll actually learn that there are two authors named Hippocrates. The great physician, the famous Hippocrates, the father of medicine, is from a land known as Kos in ancient Greece, and so he's Hippocrates of Kos. So if you're ever looking at information from Hippocrates, just make sure you're getting information from the right Hippocrates, because there are two of them. For these talks, I'm not going to share video of the text because of copyright issues. I don't have a public domain copy of the text to share in videos, so I'm simply going to be reading, and the text that I'm reading from is the copy of Hippocrates' ancient medicine that's part of the Loeb Classical Library, published by Harvard University Press. If you don't have printed copies of this work, which I assume most people won't, these Loeb editions cost usually around $20 to $25 per volume, so they can be pretty expensive, and they're really only popular among classicists, but they are available in print, and they feature both the original Greek or Latin language and an English translation. If you'd like to access the text that I'm reading, you can either buy the book, Hippocrates on Ancient Medicine, or you can subscribe to the Loeb Classical Library, a digital collection hosted by Harvard University Press at loebclassics.com, and Loeb is spelled L-O-E-B, L-O-E-B, Loeb, loebclassics.com. In this first talk, I'd like to get started in the book and read the first 4 chapters. And by chapter, I mean division of the text, so don't think long chapters. These are not that long. But I'd like to read the first 4 chapters and provide a little bit of an introduction for this study, what's important about it, how it relates to modern medicine and science, and so on. And I'd like to make a defense throughout this study for the ancient medicine. Just as a reminder, while I'm not a physician, I was a pre-med student before I studied classics, so I am comfortable studying these texts as far as modern scientific concepts are concerned. But we're really going to focus on the ancient philosophy and the art of medicine as it was understood and practiced in the ancient world. And we'll talk about this history a little bit in this talk. As I said, this is going to be a challenging series for me because this is not scripted or prepared, and I'm hoping to give you as much information as I can and make these studies as easy to understand as possible, because that's the real challenge of a teacher after all. So we're going to get started in this reading of Hippocrates' Ancient Medicine, and the Greek title of this book is Peri Archaies Hietrikees. Peri Archaies Hietrikees, which is translated into English as on or concerning ancient medicine. So please listen as I get started reading. I'm going to read a little bit and then comment to make sure that everything is clear and easy to follow. This is the beginning of On Ancient Medicine by Hippocrates. Excuse me. Hippocrates writes, and again, this is in English translation, "All those who have attempted to speak or write about medicine by assuming some postulate for themselves in their account, heat, cold, moisture, dryness, or anything else they might wish, thus narrowing down the primary cause of diseases and death in human beings, and reducing it to the same in every case by postulating these one or two things, are clearly mistaken in many points of their arguments. But they are most deserving of censure concerning the actual existing profession of medicine, to which everyone resorts in the most momentous matters, and whose good craftsmen and practitioners everyone rewards with the highest honors." And I'd like to read that again, because this is the opening statement of the book, and I'd like to make sure it's crystal clear. Hippocrates writes and says that in the works of men who wrote before him, who attempted to write on the art of medicine, it was the habit of those men, or the error of those men, to try and boil health and disease down to some single cause or small number of causes that were sort of the explanation of all disease. And Hippocrates says that they err in doing that. In other words, this isn't as simple as something that can be boiled down to one or two principles that are the cause of all health and disease. So listen to this again. He wrote, "All those who have attempted to speak or write about medicine by assuming some postulate or principle for themselves in their account, heat," and these are examples of these principles that are presented as the ultimate causes of health and disease. Heat, cold, moisture, dryness, or anything else they might wish, thus narrowing down the primary cause of diseases and death in human beings, and reducing it to the same in every case by postulating these one or two things, are clearly mistaken in many points of their arguments. But they are most deserving of censure or disapproval. So while that desire to oversimplify the art of medicine is a fault of ancient writers, he says they are most deserving of censure or disapproval concerning the actual existing profession of medicine, to which everyone resorts in the most momentous matters, and whose good craftsmen and practitioners everyone rewards with the highest honors. In other words, it's common for the art of medicine to be disrespected as if no such thing exists. Some try to boil it down to just one or two principles. Some dismiss the art as luck or superstition. And Hippocrates essentially asks, if it's true that there is actually no art of medicine, then why do men in the most momentous matters run to these craftsmen or these experts and in the end award them with the highest honors? So in this opening sentence, Socrates introduces the reason why this work that he's writing is necessary. There have been many efforts by wise men in the ancient world to try and find the secret key to health and sickness. And in this, Hippocrates says that they're wrong. They're oversimplifying it, and that's simply not true. It's a complicated study that requires careful investigation and lots of experience. But also, he desires, and again, the title of the work is On Ancient Medicine, and in this he refers to it as an art. He desires to make it clear that medicine is in fact an art that needs to be studied and practiced for mastery. There is an art of medicine. So this sets the stage for this study. We're going to investigate what the art of medicine actually is. And for us living in the 21st century, in the Christian era, we want to be asking ourselves and reflecting on how this relates to what we call the art of medicine today. Are they the same thing? Are they different? How are they different? And so on. And that's what I'm going to be exploring as we go through things, as we go through this study. Just to clarify some history at this point, because you may know the name Hippocrates, but you may not know when he lived or where he lived exactly. And I'd like to provide some chronology for you for this study, some context. It's very helpful, thinking of chronology or history, to realize that Hippocrates lived at the same time that Socrates lived. So you can keep these two men together as a historical reference point. Socrates and Hippocrates lived at the same time, almost exactly the same time. Socrates was born in 470 BC. Hippocrates was born in 460 BC. Socrates died in 399 BC, and Hippocrates died in 370 BC. So Socrates' life was 470 to 399 BC. He lived to be 71 years old. And Hippocrates' life was from 460 to 370 BC. He lived to be 90 years old. So keep Socrates and Hippocrates together historically in your mind as we talk about them. For further comparison, Aristotle was born in 384. So Aristotle was born right around the time when Socrates and Hippocrates died. So think of the end of their life as the beginning of the life of Aristotle, and Aristotle died in 322 BC. Now, in the history of medicine, the next great name in ancient medicine is that of Galen, who lived during the Roman Empire. Galen lived and worked from 129 to 216 AD. So think 2nd and 3rd century AD. So when we talk about Hippocrates being the father of medicine, we're talking about from the 4th and 5th century BC until the time of Galen in the 3rd century AD. So we're talking 700-800 years where Hippocrates is the voice in the art of medicine. And when we get to Galen later, we're going to see that Galen simply continues in this Hippocratic tradition in the art of medicine. And again, Galen died in 216 AD. So from the 5th century before Christ until the 3rd century after Christ, we have this developing but firmly established Hippocratic tradition of the art of medicine. And it includes the philosophy of Aristotle. So that's all important to keep in mind. And in a little bit, we're going to look at the author and the work that questioned this ancient art of medicine and eventually overthrew it 1,400 years later. So try to keep these dates in mind. Again, Socrates, 470 to 399 BC, Hippocrates, 460 to 370 BC, around the same time as Socrates, Aristotle being born at the end of their age, 384, and dying in 322 BC, and then 400 to 500 years later, the famous physician Galen, living from 129 to 216 AD. So that gives us a good introduction to the study. So let's get back and continue in Hippocrates' text here. Hippocrates writes, "In truth, some practitioners are mediocre, while others greatly excel. But this would not be so if there were no such thing as an art of medicine, and nothing had been investigated or discovered in it. In that case, all people would be equally inexperienced and unlearned in it, and the treatment of the sick would be completely haphazard." So Hippocrates is arguing that if there had not been an art of medicine established, a true art of medicine, then the remedies of diseases, the successful practice of medicine would not exist. There would just be randomly sick people and random stories of men and women being healed of different diseases. But there would be no measurable art that would be practiced by physicians themselves. And yet Hippocrates says this is obviously not true, because we can identify men who have been unsuccessful in the art of healing, and we can identify other men who have had great success, who greatly excel, who stand out as effective physicians. And because we can see this and we can make a difference, it's clear that an art exists, and this art is practiced by those men who habitually or consistently excel others in this work of the art of medicine. So there is an art of medicine. There is an art of investigating diseases and working to procure remedies for these diseases. Human health and disease is not left to chance or left to some whimsical divine power. It seems to please God to make human health subject to the work of wise physicians. That doesn't mean that everyone who's called a physician is such a wise physician, but nevertheless, there is such a thing as a wise physician. And in this study, we hope to understand what exactly that means. What does it mean to be a wise physician? So Hippocrates, and forgive me if I flip their names, I'll try to be mindful of that. It's hard for me to keep them separate when I talk about them. Hippocrates makes the argument here that there is, in his day, an established art of medicine. And again, this is the 5th and 4th century before Christ. This is an ancient art of medicine. And it's measurable in its success and effectiveness. It's not a theory, it's not a superstition, it's not a religion. It is a real, established, reproducible in its effects art of medicine that he's talking about. And we'll see that he emphasizes that as he continues in this work. He goes on to write, this, however, this haphazardness in the work of physicians, that it's not haphazard, this is not the case. For just as in all other arts, practitioners vary greatly in their manual skill and in their understanding, so too in medicine. And for this reason, he says, I deny that medicine needs some vain postulate or principle. We don't have to make some silly secret principle. The way subjects that cannot be directly seen or tested do when someone is attempted to give an account of them, as, for example, the things in the heavens or those under the earth. For it is never clear either to the person himself or to his hearers whether what he is saying and expounding is really true or not about what is in the heavens, that is, and what's under the earth. He uses our study of, let's say, theology, talk about things of the heavens, or even in natural philosophy, the study of the heavens themselves, which are unknowable, and also any investigation or contemplation of what exists under the earth. Men propose principles, propose theories, or make assumptions based on principles and talk about these things without certainty. But Hippocrates is arguing that medicine is not like a discussion of the heavens or of what's under the earth or inside the earth. He says, it's not like subjects that cannot be directly seen or tested when someone is attempting to give an account of them, as, for example, things in the heavens or things under the earth. For it is never clear, either to the person himself or to his hearers, whether what he is saying and expounding is really true or not, since there is no reality to which his account can be compared in order to know what is fact. Hippocrates argues this is not such a subject because we can listen to the doctrines of the art of medicine and we can test whether they are true or not. So it's very important for us to notice here, this is going to be important as we continue this study, it's very important for us to notice that Hippocrates is arguing that the art of medicine as it was practiced in the ancient world could be demonstrated to be true. It wasn't guesswork. It wasn't superstitious. It was scientific. It was experiential. The things taught and practiced by the ancient physicians were proven by experience. It's important to remember that. Remember, Hippocrates is testifying that the art of medicine that was practiced in the ancient world was demonstrable and certain. It was scientific and based on experience. It wasn't just some sort of philosophizing or theorizing about what might be true. It was demonstrated to be true and successfully practiced in the ancient world. We'll see why that's important in a few minutes. In the second paragraph or chapter, Hippocrates goes on and says, and this is very important, so pay attention to this carefully. Hippocrates writes, medicine has existed in its entirety for ages. Medicine, and he's talking about the art of medicine here. He says, medicine has existed in its entirety for ages. And again, he's writing in the 5th to the 4th century BC. And what we would consider the ancient world, he is saying in this ancient time that medicine has existed in its entirety for ages. And he says, possessing both a beginning and an established method, by means of which many and excellent discoveries have been made over a long period of time. And what remains to be discovered will also be discovered if an inquirer is competent and, being cognizant or aware of the discoveries already made, conducts his researches beginning from these. But, and this is important for our consideration of modern science and medicine, Hippocrates says, but anyone who, casting aside and rejecting all these, attempts to conduct research by some other method or in some other manner, and claims to have discovered something, has been deceived himself and is deceiving others, for it is impossible. Let me read that again. Anyone who, casting aside and rejecting all these researches and discoveries that had been conducted for a long time in the development of ancient medicine, anyone who, casting aside and rejecting these, attempts to conduct research by some other method or in some other manner, and claims to have discovered something, has been deceived himself and is deceiving others. For it is impossible. It's impossible for the ancient medicine to be false, he says, because it's been demonstrated. It's impossible for it to be false. It has been studied and practiced and proven for a long period of time, he says, in the 5th century before Christ. It's impossible that it can be false because it has been proven. He goes on to say, why it is impossible, I will attempt to demonstrate by arguing and proving that the art of medicine, that the ancient art of medicine truly exists. From this, it will become clear that it is impossible to discover anything except by the current method of research. Particularly necessary, in my opinion, for anyone discussing this art is to talk about matters familiar to ordinary people. And I'm going to take a break here to talk about this topic that he raised about the attempt for men to conduct research by some other method or in some other manner, and to claim to discover something that is different from or contrary to the ancient medicine. Now, where in history might we have seen this attempt to conduct research and establish an art of medicine that was other than the Hippocratic art of medicine? And the answer to that question is in the scientific revolution, which took place in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the scientific revolution, this is explicitly what was done in the world, what he talks about here. The ancient medicine, and not just ancient medicine, but also ancient theology, ancient philosophy, and much, much more. All of it was cast away and rejected. And you may say, come on, when did that ever take place? When did men ever rise up and say, we reject everything that has been said before us? When did anyone do that in the modern world? Well, the answer is no mystery. It's not some secret knowledge that I possess or some theory that I'm proposing. I can demonstrate that this took place at the time of the scientific revolution. The work in which this took place was a work titled The Great Instauration. The Great Instauration, which was written by Francis Bacon in the 17th century, so in the early 1600s. The work is titled The Great Instauration. And instauration, since you're listening to this, is spelled Instau. Instauration. The Great Instauration by Francis Bacon. And I'll put links in the description of this talk to these works so that you can see them in English translation. The Great Instauration by Francis Bacon. This is explicitly what Francis Bacon, who's called the father of modern science or the father of the scientific method. This is the different method that rejects Hippocratic medicine and all ancient philosophy and all ancient theology and seeks to literally establish new information, new knowledge based on research that is completely disconnected from all ancient medicine and philosophy, creating a whole new system of scientific knowledge. And if you don't believe me that that is what the scientific method actually was, I'm going to read the opening pages of Francis Bacon's work on the Great Instauration. I'm going to let Francis Bacon make this clear for you, so listen carefully. Again, this is the opening introduction or preface to Francis Bacon's work, The Great Instauration. Listen carefully. You're going to be shocked to hear what Francis Bacon says and to realize what took place in the 17th century, the effects of which we're watching unfold today in the 21st century. Francis Bacon wrote this: being convinced that the human intellect makes its own difficulties, being convinced that the human intellect makes its own difficulties, not using the true helps which are at man's disposal soberly and judiciously, whence follows manifold ignorance of things, and by reason of that ignorance mischiefs innumerable. So Francis Bacon in 1620 makes this accusation that the world at the time he lived is filled with ignorance of the natural world, because man has not made use of the quote-unquote true helps which are at his disposal, and the world is consequently filled with ignorance. And because of this ignorance, innumerable mischiefs. So this is the accusation that Francis Bacon, again, in the 1600s, makes against the world which existed before him, the ancient and medieval world. He says it's a world filled with ignorance and mischief. And this we can see in his writing. This is where the idea comes from that we refer to this period of history, European or Catholic history, as the Dark Age, right? We talk about the Dark Ages being this period of history which is essentially Christian history, called the Dark Age by modern men. And they talk about some imaginary golden age that existed before, which can never be identified but is always assumed to have existed. We see Francis Bacon talking of the past in this same way. He says, being convinced of this, he thought all trial should be made, whether that commerce between the mind of man and the nature of things, which is more precious than anything on earth, or at least than anything that is of the earth, might by any means be restored, listen to this, might be restored to its perfect and original condition. So in this work, Francis Bacon is proposing that we restore a perfect, undefiled knowledge of the natural world, and he refers to it as the perfect and original condition of that knowledge, referring back to the knowledge that Adam and Eve had of the natural world in the Garden of Eden before the fall. Francis Bacon is proposing that we recover the original knowledge that Adam and Eve had of the natural world before it was corrupted by everything that took place after the fall. That's a pretty lofty goal to be proposing, and yet this is what Francis Bacon, as the father of modern science in the 1600s, was seeking to do in his mind, in his own understanding and thought. That it might be restored to its perfect and original condition, or if that may not be, if that's impossible, yet be reduced to a better condition than that in which it now is. And let's realize the learning that existed at that time might be represented by what we call scholastic philosophy. This was around the time of the Protestant Reformation, which was part of this multi-headed rebellion against traditional Catholicism and classical philosophy. So Francis Bacon proposes seeking to restore a true knowledge of the natural world, which he asserts has been lost. He accuses everyone before him of having been ignorant and mischievous, and he's proposing using some true helps which are at man's disposal, restoring a true knowledge of the natural world, maybe even the perfect and original knowledge of the natural world. So this was his ambition, and we can wonder how in the world did he think that he was going to do that, and how in the world he thought he could produce something of such a quality and surpass the work of men like Hippocrates and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all of the natural philosophers and Galen, the physician of the 3rd century A.D., and of the philosophical works of Thomas Aquinas and so on. How did he think that he would surpass this? How did he judge them to be ignorant and mischievous? And how did he think he would surpass them? You see what a strange proposal this scientific revolution really was. And this is coming from the mouth of the father of modern science himself, Francis Bacon. So how would he possibly suggest that we do this? He goes on to say, now that the errors which have hitherto prevailed, he asserts that the knowledge existing is in error, and which will prevail forever, should, if the mind be left to go its own way, either by the natural force of the understanding or by the help of the aids and instruments of logic. Notice how he refers to the mind and this use of logic as an instrument, which is what the whole Aristotelian philosophy is based on. That's what the organon or the instrument is in Aristotelian philosophy. It's the art of reasoning. So Francis Bacon is accusing logic of being the cause of ignorance and mischief throughout world history. How interesting is that? One by one, they will never correct themselves, he said. This is not a thing to be hoped for, because the primary notions of things which the mind readily and passively imbibes, stores up, and accumulates are false, confused, and over hastily abstracted from the facts. So Francis Bacon has this idea that everything that man thinks or reasons about is false. So the mind of man left to itself, or even left to the instrument of logic, just imbibes, stores up, and accumulates false, confused, and overly hasty ideas that are drawn from the actual facts. He goes on to say, nor are secondary and subsequent notions that come from them, nor are they less arbitrary and inconstant. Whence it follows that the entire fabric of human reason, which we employ in the inquisition of nature, is badly put together and built up, like some magnificent structure without any foundation. So realize what he's saying here. He's just wiping away this entire established history of natural philosophy, calling it all false, saying it's all in error, wiping it all out in one big swipe. He refers to all human knowledge at that point as some magnificent structure without any foundation. He's saying there has never been any proof, any demonstration, any actual observation of the facts. It's all false, and the world is filled with ignorance and mischief because of that ignorance. Quite an audacious thing to say, and yet this is the founding of modern science. He goes on to say, while men are occupied in admiring and applauding the false powers of the mind, that is reason, while men are occupied in admiring and applauding the false powers of the mind, they pass by and throw away those true powers which, if it be supplied with proper aids, and can itself be content to wait upon nature, instead of vainly affecting to overrule her, are within its reach. So he argues that the reason why men turn to reason to investigate the world is because they're simply impatient and careless, and they don't really seek to understand the natural world because they don't use the true aids that they should be using. And we'll find out in a minute what those aids are that he's recommending. He says, because of this, because they think that reason is going to help them, there was but one course left to him, that is to Francis Bacon. There's only one option. There's only one way for us to fix this problem. It is to try the whole thing anew upon a better plan. And listen to this, to commence a total reconstruction of sciences, arts, and all human knowledge raised upon the proper foundations. So if you hear people talking today about the so-called Great Reset, and they think this is such a profound idea, the Great Reset took place 400 years ago. The Great Reset is not taking place today. It took place 400 years ago. That's what the scientific revolution was. That's what the Protestant Reformation was. That's what the Renaissance was. They were different parts of what I would say truly should be called the Great Reset. And this is not, again, this is not my theory. This is what the fathers of those movements said themselves. This is what Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, said himself explicitly in his own writing. I'm going to read that again. Because men are going to be occupied admiring and applauding the false powers of the mind and pass by and throw away the true powers, which I'll talk about in a minute, there's only one course of action left, Francis Bacon says, and that is to try the whole thing anew upon a better plan and to commence a total reconstruction of sciences, arts, and all human knowledge raised upon the proper foundations. And that, of course, is his opinion of the proper foundations. So in this work, The Great Instauration, Francis Bacon proposed a complete reset of human learning. And this is where we find the separation of the wisdom of the ancients, or even we could say the wisdom and tradition of Catholic tradition, the wisdom of Aristotelian philosophy, the wisdom of real Western civilization, of Judeo-Christian civilization. Here, in the work of Francis Bacon in the 1600s, we find all that is old cast away and a complete reset proposed for all human learning, all the sciences, all the arts, and all human knowledge, based on a different method, a different foundation, not the Hippocratic method, not the Socratic method, not the Aristotelian method, the method of the ancient world, not based on that method, not the scholastic method utilized by Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic philosophers, not those traditional methods, which are really all one method in a continuous development, not that ancient method, but a new method, a new instrument by which everything will be reset. And this is why Francis Bacon's famous book is called Novum Organum, the new instrument, or the new method. And what is this method? It's what we call today the scientific method. The scientific method was proposed by Francis Bacon as the right way to establish human knowledge, human arts, and human sciences, and everything outside of the scientific method, everything that was not based on the scientific method, was to be cast out as ignorant and mischievous. So if you wonder, why is logic not a part of the modern school curriculum? Look at the local Catholic school, because Catholics aren't free from blame in this. Look at the local Catholic school. Is logic taught as the instrument of learning in the local Catholic school? No, it's not. What's taught as the method in the modern school? The scientific method. That's why there's always an emphasis on math and natural sciences, according to this method of Francis Bacon. Why is the curriculum in a modern Catholic school different from what existed in a school that would be taught by Thomas Aquinas or St. Ignatius of Loyola? Why is the curriculum different? Because this great reset took place in the 1600s. And again, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the stated purpose of Francis Bacon's work, which became the manual for modern science, according to the scientific method. This is where the Great Reset took place. A completely new investigation, all new research, based on a different method. So keep that in mind, and let's go back to Hippocrates now. Let me read the passage I read before moving and talking about Francis Bacon. Hippocrates wrote, and this is the second chapter or paragraph of his work on ancient medicine. Hippocrates wrote, "Medicine has existed in its entirety for ages, possessing a beginning and an established method, by means of which many and excellent discoveries have been made over a long period of time. What remains to be discovered will be discovered if an inquirer is competent and, being cognizant of the discoveries already made, conducts his researches beginning from these. But anyone who, casting aside and rejecting all these, attempts to conduct research by some other method or in some other manner, and claims to have discovered something, has been deceived himself and is deceiving others." Hippocrates, if we could tell him about the scientific revolution, if we could tell Hippocrates about Francis Bacon and the great Instauration and the Novum Organum, he would tell us that Francis Bacon is deceived himself and is deceiving others. And this, what Hippocrates warns would be a deception, is the foundation of our entire modern society. Every aspect of life is now directed by this modern Baconian scientific method. Just all you have to do is think back to COVID, when you were told, trust the science. You were told, and this in a democratic society, you were told, or I should say, to make this clearer, the people were told, you have no say. This is not for you to judge. you have to listen to, quote unquote, the science. That's the foundation of modern society. The society we're living in today is the Frankenstein society that was created by the scientific revolution, by Francis Bacon and the other scientists who cast away all classical philosophy, all of the wisdom of the ancients, all authoritative teaching of the scholastic and Aristotelian tradition, and claimed to start everything from scratch. And as we learn in the writings of Francis Bacon, the way that the truth is to be discovered is by experimental material science or physical science. And so any spiritual influence is not included in any attempt to explain what's going on in the natural world. It is a completely materialistic approach to understanding the world, which is exactly the opposite of what God himself taught us in the sacred scriptures. If we think about the book of Job, for example, God explicitly tells us in the book of Job that there are spiritual causes of material experiences. And this is part of the mystery of human life. Not that every effect has some spiritual cause, but that spiritual causes are possible in human experiences. This is taught to us in the book of Genesis, where God explicitly says that he directly and intentionally created all of the plants and all of the animals, quote unquote, according to their kinds, not in some kind of primordial goo that would simply be worked out through evolution over billions of years. He explicitly says that he created the species of plants and animals according to their kind in the beginning. And that raises the whole question of what exactly that means in the book of Genesis. You know, some believe the six-day modern creation explanation. I personally believe in St. Augustine's explanation that the creation of the world was miraculous and instantaneous, and what we read in Genesis is simply an explanation of the order of the created world, which God actually created in an instant, complete and entire. But that's a separate discussion. But evolution is a product of this scientific method. Evolution was never held by anyone in the ancient world, except we could say possibly by the ancient Epicureans, who were atomists, as modern scientists are, but that's, again, another discussion. But Hippocrates warned us in his work on ancient medicine, and we're talking about human health, and it's no surprise that the greatest controversies in modern society center about the issue of human health. Hippocrates testified in the ancient world that the ancient art of medicine was established over studies and experience gathered over a long period of time, and that it was certain that any other system or any other method would be impossible. And if anyone claimed to pursue this knowledge of an art of medicine by some other means, he would be deceived himself and one who deceives others. So when we hear modern physicians or modern scientists talking about how much they love Hippocrates, it's simply not true. When we see modern medical schools having graduates recite the Hippocratic Oath, if you investigate it, you'll find that what they're professing is not the Hippocratic Oath at all. It's a modern revision that is still called the Hippocratic Oath, but they don't follow the teaching of Hippocrates, and yet for some reason they try to pretend that they do. Let's move on here and wrap up because we're already at the hour mark in this first reading. I said I was going to try to read the first 4 chapters, but we're still in the second chapter here, so let's just finish this up. He said, anyone who, casting aside and rejecting all these, attempts to conduct research by some other method or in some other manner and claims to have discovered something has been deceived and is deceiving others because it is impossible. Why it is impossible, I will attempt to demonstrate by arguing and proving that the art of medicine truly exists. And from this it will become clear that it is impossible to discover anything except by the current, that is the ancient or Hippocratic method of research. And I'm going to stop there in the midst of that second section, because it gives us a good place to cut off and end this talk. So we've got a good introduction, I think, to Hippocrates' work on ancient medicine. I think we've established the context and importance of this work. And, Hippocrates, again, I'm sorry if I have switched up the names Hippocrates and Socrates. I do that all the time because, like I said, they lived at the same time and I always confuse them with each other. But if we think about what Hippocrates' goal is in this work, it's to prove to us that a true and firmly established art of medicine existed, so that future research and study could be built upon the existing art. If we keep that in mind and realize that Hippocrates doesn't merely assert that, as Francis Bacon likes to assert things with no evidence, like just assert that knowledge of the past is false and that the world is filled with ignorance and mischief. Those opinions that he states, being the so-called father of modern science, are amazing. I used the term audacious before to describe them. Hippocrates doesn't intend to talk about things the way Francis Bacon and modern scientists do. Hippocrates says that he intends in this work to demonstrate by arguing and proving that the art of medicine truly exists and that any other approach or any other attempt to establish a knowledge of such a subject is impossible. So that's going to be our challenge and goal for the next, or for the rest of our study, is to learn this demonstration that Hippocrates gives us to show us, and hopefully to convince us that what has developed in the modern world is false, is deceiving, as if we can't see that by the fruits already. Realize that all of this stuff we see today, this transgender craziness, homosexuality, the manufacturing of all of these illegal drugs, this nuclear weapon terrorism that we see currently being conducted by Russia and by the United States as well. We look at the fruits of modern science, and do we find that human knowledge has increased? No, we don't. We find that a sort of tyrannical use of science has increased, and a claim that everything is known with certainty and above all questioning or public discussion. We see that spirit somehow arising, and among common people we find a spirit of agnosticism developing, where people feel like they don't know anything to be true or false anymore. They if you ask around, people can't even explain what a healthy diet looks like, what a healthy life looks like. They can't talk confidently about their body. Their bodies have become complete mysteries to them. People in the ancient world didn't talk like modern people do, with this confusion and uncertainty. And yet this is the spirit of the modern age, which is supposedly scientific and based on a true foundation of human learning and science and art. But we find no such thing in reality. We find scientists publishing scientific articles and research-based articles in journals that contradict each other. How can there be contradiction if we're publishing the results of reproducible experiments with results that can be observed? How can there be contradiction? Obviously, what this modern science, this modern scientific method claims and what it does are two different things, and we can judge this by the fruits. So anyway, our goal in this study is to learn this demonstration from Hippocrates that there was an established art of medicine and that any other system was impossible, because this system was based on proof by study and research and experiments that took place for long periods of time and were firmly established and known in the 5th century before Christ. And remember, Hippocrates said that the art of medicine was ancient and entirely complete. So there was more to be learned in terms of investigating new problems and new issues, but there was an established system or art of medicine already in place in the 5th century, which was being practiced by Hippocrates and would be practiced in later generations by men like Galen, and then practiced all through medieval history. All through medieval history, the same system, the same philosophy of medicine, practiced all through history, accepted by wise men like Thomas Aquinas, practiced and enriched by a doctor of the church like St. Hildegard. And yet when we come to Francis Bacon, we find this whole tradition of science and medicine cast off as ignorant, mischievous, and false. Realize what we've got to accept for that to be true. We've got to accept that Hippocrates didn't know what he was talking about, that Aristotle didn't know what he was talking about, that St. Thomas Aquinas didn't know what he was talking about, that Galen didn't know what he was talking about, that St. Hildegard didn't know what she was talking about, but Francis Bacon knew the truth. Realize what's at stake in this discussion. Hopefully we can sort through this and come out of this study confident in knowing what's true and what's false. And I think if we do that, then we can get into other studies in ancient medicine and ancient natural philosophy and really make some progress with respect for the ancient philosophers, realizing that they're not ignorant, superstitious, mischievous cavemen as they're caricatured as being, but they are some of the most virtuous and wise and experienced men who have to this day ever lived. I hope that I can convince you of that and that you'll undertake these studies with me, because I think you'll find a great deal of comfort and clarity in these studies. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions at this point, please feel free to get in touch. But I intend to continue this probably once a week as I have time, and we'll just slowly make our way through Hippocrates' work on ancient medicine, and then, explore rabbit trails and corollary issues that come up along the way. So I hope that's helpful. God bless.